Alrighty, good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about our local ecosystem project. To start, some useful ecology vocabulary. We were asked to define a terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. A terrestrial is a ecosystem which its main components are on land, and an aquatic ecosystem is its main components are in the water or a water environment. So the examples that I got were for the aquatic ecosystem was a river. Most of the abiotic and biotic factors mostly pertain to the river, so it's a good example. And in the forests, as you can see, there's no aquatic biome. It is fully on land. All the abiotic factors are on land. All the biotic factors are on land. It mostly consists of a land uh, atmosphere. And then some useful ecology. Generally, it starts with a producer, which is a plant that absorbs the sunlight from the sun. And then after that, it would be the primary consumer, which usually generally consumes that plant and consumes the energy with it. And then the secondary consumer, which consumes the primary consumer in most cases, getting the energy from the producer and the first consumer. And then the tertiary consumer would be the apex predator, generally in most cases. So sharks in their aquatic ecosystems, or maybe eagles or hawks in like a mountainous ecosystem, a terrestrial ecosystem. So those would be the tertiary and they have the densest energy because they garner the energy from the secondary consumer, the primary consumer, and the producer. And then you have your decomposers, which break down loose or organic material. And then you have your dentrivores, which, unlike decomposers, they break down loose or dead organic material in the soil and recycle the nutrients throughout the ecosystem using their mouth. So these are organisms like worms and fungus. And then there's interspecific competition, which, when broken down, interspecific competition is a competition directly between two or more different species. Um, it's usually over a bigger matter, such as land or territory. An intraspecific competition, it's where two or more organisms are competing, but it has to do with two or more organisms that are a part of the same species. So it would be like bucks, like elk fighting each other for land or territory, or bucks fighting each other for mates. So that's the example. For my local ecosystem, I know generally I selected the whole wash in my neighborhood, but the plants and animals that were obtained from that portion of land were in a small section, like on the side of the, the chasm. So now we're going to talk about what components affect ecosystem life, and we're going to talk about abiotic factors in this on this slide. And a lot of the abiotic factors have to do with geography, has to do with the amount of sunlight, it has to do with the amount of brush, the amount of trees. So there are a lot of different components when it comes to it. The medium on the ground, whether it's rocky, whether it's covered in dirt, grass. So there are a lot of abiotic factors that affect different organisms and how they hide and where they make their homes, where they burrow. So yeah, like I said, there are just a ton of abiotic factors. Thick brush on the bottom layer of wash. In this specific scenario in the wash, the abiotic factors would include the thick brush on the bottom of the wash, like all the dead debris and stuff. It creates a nice airy environment down there that a lot of critters can hide in, but a lot of critters can't get into, such as coyotes. Water naturally fills up the wash, so naturally that would be another abiotic factor that would greatly affect the ecosystem. And the area as a whole, it's right in the sun. There's not a lot of tree coverage, so it gets a lot of sunlight. That would be another abiotic factor. But then again, there's a lot of sunlight, but there's also a lot of shade and a lot of places to hide because of the brush. So abiotic factors affect each other, and they affect the organisms inside the environment. So the plant life. The first plant that is in the ecosystem is a Mimosa aculecarpa. It's an angiosperm, and it is also an autotroph, and it belongs to the family Fabaceae and the genus Mimosa. A couple characteristics of this tree, or shrub, you should say. The twigs are hairy and armed with backwards pointing spines, so it's good for they catch in the clothing and stuff. It's good for seed dispersion, so that's another adaptation. And then the alternate leaves are bipinnate, which refers to the leaf orientation. And then some adaptations that they've gained is the production of thorns, which is good for protection against predators, and it's good for seed dispersion. So one of two things, a little double adaptation there. And then the other adaptation is it is adapted to Arizona temperatures because it can survive up to negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and it can survive in temperatures like 100 plus because of Arizona. It gets hot and it gets cold on some nights. Plant number 2 is the rough cockleburr. There were plenty of these in there, including inside the brush that many of the critters in the ecosystem like to hide. It's an angiosperm. It's a flowering plant. It's also an autotroph. It belongs to family Asteraceae, which is almost similar to the first plant, and it belongs to genus Xanthium. So a couple characteristics are the burrs on the plant consist of backwards facing hooks that grab onto clothing, animal fur, and so on. And that's also another variety of seed dispersion, kind of like the last plant that we talked about. This plant is considered a weed and an herb, while on top of that, it has also gained the characteristic of being poisonous in order to protect itself from what it'll cause it harm. So other animals eating it, maybe like critters. There are a lot of different situations in which the plant can be harmed, and so it's made some adaptations to protect itself. So some adaptations, like mentioned before, it's great for seed dispersion, those backwards facing spines, because they attach to clothing, they attach to animals, and those animals drive the seeds further and further, spreading the plants out. So it's great for seed dispersion, and it's great to create an environment where the plant can thrive because it's being carried everywhere, it's being grown everywhere, so it won't die out, won't go extinct. So this plant is considered a weed because of its high mortality rate. It gets destroyed without a second thought because, it's annoying. They get stuck to clothing. They get everywhere. But it's because of that, it is adapted to grow extremely fast in order to reproduce because it's a weed. Weeds generally grow quick because they're unwanted and they're pulled easily. So there's another adaptation to prevent it from perishing or going extinct. Plant number 3 is the Brachiosaurithroid shrub, which is an angiosperm. Also, same with the other plants. It's a flowering plant and it's an autotroph. This plant belongs to family Compositae and genus Baccharis. So, a couple of characteristics. It is also known widely as a desert bloom, and in order to reproduce, there has to be a male and a separate female plant nearby. So it's kind of unique. Their flowers and seeds spread by the use of wind. So they're extremely light, so the wind picks up, it takes them away, carries them further into the wash. So unlike the other plants with the backwards facing hooks, the seed dispersion on this plant is quite a bit different, different method using the wind instead of relying on its spikes or relying on somebody to rub up against it. So, which generally is a more guaranteed way of seed dispersal. And then some adaptations. This plant spreads out very quickly due to its flowering technique with the use of wind. Due to the plant needing a separate female and male, it is adapted to be able to spread far and wide to increase its chances of production. So if there's not a female plant close, it gives the opportunity to spread as much of those seeds as possible so it can increase the amount that it can breed. Their flowers and seeds spread by the use of wind until they're extremely light and they can go great distances. They could blow miles if it was a really windy day. So a couple adaptations. Due to the plant needing a separate female, the plant again has adapted to be able to disperse its seeds very easily and very quickly. The second adaptation found in these plants is that its ability to endure brutal temperatures in the Arizona desert, because this is not originally an Arizona native plant, but it has come here and it has adapted to endure the temperatures because it can get very high on the 100 plus range and it can get low as 30 on some nights. It has been very cold. All right, next we're going to talk about the animal life inside of the wash. So the first animal that I noticed in that same area, and it was on the I found it on the Mimosa clecarpa tree. This would be the finch, which is a vertebrate. It's in phylum Chordata, and it's in the family Frigilidae. And it is also in the genus Hemimorphus. So a vertebrate is any animal consisting of a backbone, and birds in general, most of them have them, and a house finch is not an exception. Finches are songbirds, and they use songs to attract mates and other things, like many other creatures. It's a technique and a way to attract mates to increase their reproduction rates. Finches have heavily adapted to live in urban areas, such as subadaptation is the ability to use. So they have gained the ability to use human trash and waste, such as plastics and stuff, to build their nests. So they've heavily adapted to urban environments. Um, and finches also use their thick stubbed beak to crack open seeds. They've adapted through there. There are other varieties of finches that do not excel in this way, but this specific species or genus of finch have adapted to be able to crack open seeds and such with their thick beak. Through different nesting and bonding behaviors, house finches are able to reproduce in almost any environment, and because of that, many other characteristics like a high mortality rate. At an older age, finches have a very high production rate, making them a common everyday bird. They're very common. They breed everywhere. And the diet of this animal generally consists of seeds because of its adaptation to its beak to be able to break them open because of its environment. There are a lot of seeds and empty shells in this ecosystem. And the house finch is diurnal, which is the opposite of nocturnal, obviously. It operates mostly in the day and then sleeps at night, unlike most other predators. And number 2, the second animal we're going to find is in kingdom Animalia, family Chordodelalia, and order Megaloptera. This animal is a Dobson fly, and it's an invertebrate. If you look at the images below, you can see that there is a backbone, but rather segmented sections of hard shell that consist of a thorax, head, and a tail end. This means that they're invertebrates. Those are just the requirements of what it means. Dobson flies belong to phylum Arthropoda because they have a body with jointed appendages and them being invertebrates. So both of those correlate to them being in the phylum Arthropoda. As the creature changes from its larval form into a Dobson fly, it develops wings, which it has adapted against predators, and it's developed pincers for eating and for protection. Generally, when they eat, they stick to small things like insects and worms. So they're a carnivore in the most practical sense. Dobson flies are weird in the sense that they are sexually dimorphic, meaning that different species of Dobson flies produce different offspring and characteristics. So many might not have wings, many might not have as large pincers, many might have a different body style, different body formations. So it just all depends. Different species and genuses of the Dobson fly will produce different, forms of the Dobson fly. And again, these insects can mostly be seen as carnivores because they rely on eating smaller insects and worms and such like that. Now, the third is another bird. This one is very common across Arizona, but especially in wash areas or desert areas where there's not a lot of civilization. These are quail. They are a vertebrate. They're in phylum Chordata, family Passanidae, and order Galliformes. This quail has a backbone and therefore qualifies as a vertebrate because all vertebrates have a backbone. They belong to phylum Chordata because they have a backbone and a spinal cord, and they also have a dorsal nerve cord, which splits the brain and spinal cord into 2 distinct pieces. In order to remain safe and guarded over their young for the first summer, they resort to staying in the nest while eating berries, seeds, and leaves that they've collected over time. So that's another adaptation to keep them and their children protected. Quail also have learned to forage food from the ground to increase their wide diet variety because there's not always diet forms for them in their area, so they've adapted to increase their variety so they can get more nutrients for their young. Quail prefer bushy environments. If you see a herd like a group of quail that will be huddled up in a bush or huddled up under some brush, they hate staying out in the open. They're always covered somewhere. They can have up to 12 eggs, which helps increase their production rate for children and their higher increase of offspring. And what they'll do is when the female is off looking for food, the male will help, like other species, kind of like foxes and coyotes, the male will help take care of the eggs and the offspring. Also kind of like penguins because they have a protector and they have a food forager. So 2 separate things, and the male will help. It's a very great relationship between the male and the female between quails. Quails are considered omnivores because they heavily rely on berries and seeds, but will also forage around and eat insects given the opportunity. Again, their diet variety has increased drastically because they can't always find what they normally eat. Quail like to practice a thing called speciation, which means that in a population of quail, different species will gain different characteristics depending on their environment. So quail are mostly diurnal, but can be nocturnal depending on the species of quail. So again, kind of like the Dobson fly, it just depends. Different quails do different things. Different quails have different characteristics and adaptations that help them survive for that specific environment type and that ecosystem. So it all just depends. Now, we're going to start off with the local ecosystem biomass period that I've produced. For the producers, it's going to be our three plants, the three plants that first gain energy from the sun. So they're the first stepping stone of the biomass period. And then you have your primary consumer, which is the Dobson fly, which in some cases is an omnivore. So it does eat plant matter sometimes, but it's mostly a carnivore. So that would still fit in the primary consumer role. And then the secondary consumer would be the quail and the house finch, because the quail and the house finch eat insects on top of that. So they would gain the energy from the producer and that primary consumer, the Dobson fly. And then the tertiary consumer, which I had none in the animals that I selected, but in general, in that ecosystem, just as an example, a tertiary consumer would be like a coyote or an owl, in which it would eat the secondary consumer, quails or finches. Rarely because they're birds, but because of the way this ecosystem worked out and the organisms that I chose, that's the only example I could pick. So it would be the top predator that eats that, and the coyote and the owl would have the densest energy mass because they have the energy from the producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and it all accumulates over that period of time. And then finally, we're going to move on to the food web. So in most scenarios, I have it broken down. So the green arrows represents a relationship between the quail and the producers, as the quail eat the seeds from them and use them as cover from the predators because they like bushy areas, so they hide them. So that would represent the positive relationship between the bird, the quail, and the plants. The same thing for the finches. They like to hide in brush. Sometimes they like to rest on dead trees. But yeah, the gray arrows represent the finch's relationship with the producers, because they also rely on the seeds and the flowers and the food from the producers. So the quail and the finch are kind of in the same scenario. Finches just like to be more aerial, and quail are more on the ground critters. They're more terrestrial than finches. And then the blue arrow represents the relationship between the Dobson fly and the producer, as it eats the buds of this plant and certain areas of the plant. And uses it to hunt other small organisms, because lots of people like to hide in bushy places, or lots of organisms like to hide in bushy situations, like in bushes. And the Dobson fly finds that a great place to find food because they all like to hide in there. So yeah, that would be the end. Here's my works cited. Thank you for listening to my ecosystem.